But then, in 1989, after nearly a decade of failed war, the Soviets finally withdrew from Afghanistan, and then just 2 years later, the Soviet Union itself collapsed. In the aftermath, the Russian Federation that emerged was no longer the committed communist and atheist state that it used to be, and so relations between it and the theocracy in Iran gradually began to improve from outright hostility to fairly normal. By 2000, Iran was the third largest customer in the world of Russian-produced weapons, and by 2007, the Russians even agreed to begin supplying the Iranians with their S-300 missile defense system. But the relationship between Moscow and Tehran didn't begin evolving into full-fledged alliance until civil war erupted within Syria in 2011. As both regimes suddenly found themselves desperately backing the exact same side there, the long-standing Arab nationalist regime of Bashar al-Assad and his Syrian Ba'ath Party. To the Islamic Republic, the Assad regime in Syria remaining in power was of equal strategic importance, but for completely different reasons. You see, Syria, along with Iraq and Lebanon, all comprise the key parts of what the Iranians like to call their axis of resistance, their geopolitical strategy aimed at countering all of their perceived enemies across the Middle East. The United States, Israel, and the Gulf-era monarchies in exactly that order of severity. Ever since the 1979 Islamic Revolution shifted Iran from an ally of Israel's and America's to an unapologetic enemy, they have found significant common ground with the Assad regime in Syria because, despite their significant ideological differences between theocratic Islamic nationalism and nominally secular Arab nationalism, they share the exact same common enemies. Syria has maintained a permanent official state of war with Israel ever since the founding of the Israeli state in 1948. Syria has never recognized Israeli statehood, and Syria has remained the most militantly anti-Israel state in the Arab world. Israel continues to occupy the Golan Heights, which they seized from Syria during the Six-Day War of 1967, and later unilaterally declared to annex into Israel in 1981. A move that went unrecognized by any other country in the world until the United States officially did so in 2019. And even better, from Iran's perspective, the Assad regime in Syria is also largely dominated by the country's minority Shia Muslim adjacent branch of Alawite Muslims, diminishing the religious differences between the ruling regimes of Iran and Syria. And so, with Iran and Syria both wishing to see the eventual destruction of Israel and the rolling back of American influence in the Middle East, it only made sense for them each to cooperate wherever they could. But standing in between them for decades was Saddam Hussein's Ba'athist and Arab nationalist regime in Iraq, who hated both of them for different reasons. Saddam hated the Iranians because he feared their exportation of the Islamic Revolution into Iraq's majority Shia Muslim population. And he hated the Syrian Ba'athist Arab nationalist government because, while they shared the same ideology and the same party, Saddam felt that he should be the senior leader and that Syria's Ba'athist party should have subordinated itself beneath his own authority, which the Assad regime was unwilling to do. But the civil war in Syria threatened to destroy all of Iran's decades of efforts in Lebanon, putting Hezbollah into its position of power against Israel. Were the pro-Iranian and pro-Hezbollah Assad regime to fall from power and a pro-Western regime take its place, Iran's ability to funnel weapons and supplies by land to Hezbollah and Lebanon would be destroyed. And so Iran's ability to attack Israel and project power into the Mediterranean would be significantly crippled. And so to prevent that from happening, the Iranians found themselves fighting side by side with the Russians in Syria, who were trying to defend their port and naval strategy against NATO. It was largely the combination of Iranian forces and their proxies fighting on the Assad regime's behalf on the ground, and the Russian Air Force fighting for the Assad regime in the skies, that won Assad back control over most of the country by 2019. And then, following Russia's invasion of Ukraine in 2022, the Kremlin began having to rely on Iran in the country even further. The Russians pulled out most of their troops, mercenaries, and equipment from Syria in order to redeploy them into the more pressing theater in Ukraine. Trade between the two countries accelerated further as Russia's access to the European market was decimated, and as the Russians began being forced to pivot their vast exports of oil and gas away from Europe and towards Asian economies like China and India. India has emerged a particular help to the Russians since the invasion of Ukraine began, because India wishes to pursue a policy of global non-alignment, similar to how it operated between Moscow and Washington during the Cold War era. The Indian government has declined to apply any sanctions on the Russian regime following the invasion of Ukraine. and considers the war to be entirely a European affair that is not of their concern. Russia and India therefore have a very close economic relationship, but getting Russia's exports to India is, shall we say, complicated. The traditional route for Russia to export oil, gas, fertilizer, and arms to the Indian market takes them from St. Petersburg and then by ship through the Baltic Sea and the Danish Straits controlled by NATO, through the English Channel controlled by NATO, through the Strait of Gibraltar controlled on the northern side by NATO, across the Mediterranean and through the Suez Canal, then across the Red Sea and through the dangerous Bab el-Mandeb Strait with major American and French military bases in Djibouti, and then finally across the Arabian Sea to India. This route is long, expensive, and after the Russian invasion of Ukraine, geopolitically tenuous, as it passes through no less than 5 major narrow maritime choke points, 4 of which are heavily under the influence of NATO member states and their militaries. And this is where Iran once again comes into play to assist the Russians. Long aware of their important but vulnerable maritime trade route to India, the Russians and Indians have jointly for decades now been working together on a project known as the International North-South Transport Corridor, a vast interconnected system of railways, highways, and ships that can transport Russian exports in the north more directly to India down in the south. Indian studies have suggested that once fully operational, the INSTC will reduce the price of Russian exports to India by about 30% and reduce the travel time of exports by about 40%, while it will also further enable Russian exports to make their way to India without having to pass through any geopolitically sensitive choke points, meaning India can keep getting cheap resources necessary to power and advance their economy, and Russia can keep getting cash to circumvent Western financial sanctions without the serious risk of disruption. Iran is therefore the key intermediary between the Indian and Russian markets, as part of the plan will entail loading Russian exports up onto ships that will flow down the Caspian Sea, enter into Iran, and then travel by train and highway across the country towards Iran's southern ports on the Gulf of Oman, and then continue on from there across the Arabian Sea towards India by ship. Iran thus represents a geographically vital area for the Russians to export their goods across and into India. And this is yet a further reason for the Russians to collaborate with the Iranians and expand their growing partnership. In the months that followed Putin's meeting with the Ayatollah in June of 2022, Iran was happy to then begin providing the Russians with their drones, missiles, body armor, and more for 4 primary reasons. First, since the Americans are supplying the Ukrainian side with American-made weapons, Iran supplying the Russian side with Iranian-made weapons grants them a unique opportunity to see how their own gear stacks up against the Americans' gear, and what lessons they can learn from that in preparation for a potential war with the United States themselves in the future. Second, the Russians have in turn agreed to sell the Iranians some of their more advanced fighter jets like the Su-35, and potentially even their advanced air defense systems like the S-400, which the Iranians probably want to use to defend their nuclear weapons research facilities from any potential Israeli airstrikes. And that leads us to the third reason why Iran is providing the Russians with military equipment to fight in Ukraine. They may be hoping that the Russians go a step further and actually assist them with developing a nuclear weapon. Despite vast differences in ideology and geopolitical goals between the regimes of Iran, Russia, and the People's Republic of China, they do all seemingly share one common belief: that the days of a unipolar world order dominated by the United States that began after the end of the Cold War in 1992 is beginning to come to an end.
آنچه در مورد ما میگویند